So we want to remember what microaggressions are. And microaggressions are brief or commonplace words or actions that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights to the person in front of us. Microaggressions can be intentional or they can be unintentional. In many ways, the intention does not matter because the result is harm. But it's worse than just being insulting or harming the person in front of us. We have evidence that hidden biases fuel inadequate treatment of Black Americans. Research shows that implicit biases about Black people having higher pain tolerances mean that pain often isn't treated adequately. We see that African American women have exponentially higher rates of death and childbirth as compared to white women. There are more and more examples that we can share. Overall, what I want to say about that is that a generous perspective of the situation could be that racial and ethnic disparities in care are not intentional, but instead have the result of complex influences, including implicit biases that care providers do not even know they have. These come out of microaggressions. And we learned about many different types of microaggressions in the context of critical race theory, and you'll see these many types listed on this slide. What we want to do, though, is highlight the ways we've seen some of these specific microaggressions playing out in the news and in social media in response to the protests, the police violence, and the Black Lives Matter movement. The first microaggression we want to talk about is denial of individual racism. This is something like making a statement like, I'm not a racist because I have a Black friend. Just because we have a friend who's a person of color does not mean that we don't have a bias. And even if we personally, as an individual, don't think that we hold a racial bias, we know that most people in our society do. We see that there is a lack of personal awareness about both personal bias and systemic racism. The next type of microaggression we want to highlight is colorblindness. You may hear statements such as "all lives matter" as a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. We are seeing efforts to educate about the importance of recognizing the way Black lives are impacted by police brutality in posters showcased by protesters around the country. And an example of that kind of poster is pictured here. The point being made is that while everyone's life inherently matters, the phrase Black Lives Matter is raising awareness of a specific way the Black community is experiencing inequity. Making a statement like "all lives matter" is an example of colorblindness because it begins to overlook the concept of race and the structural inequities that are happening. Of microaggression we want to highlight is the assumption of criminality. We often see this as racial profiling. Racial profiling takes many forms, and it includes the assumption that a person of color, particularly a Black man, is participating in criminal action or doing something illegal when they are, in fact, just out conducting their everyday life. The research shows us that people of color are more likely to be racially profiled by people who live in the community and by law enforcement. This kind of microaggression leads to unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system, police brutality, and even death. The Black Lives Matter protests are raising awareness of the way racial profiling and police brutality are linked.